good afternoon or good morning. We're just in the middle. I'm very happy to present our session of the Neighbor lecture series, which, as you know, it's a lecture series that we have organized among the laboratories that are busy or focus on history and theory. Alfredo Tierman, Sarah Nichols, Christo Van Garraway, and myself. So it's really an effort to break through the lab feudal domain and to create actually a more collective ethos in the school. And the idea is that each of us invite a guest that we think represents a kind of provocative, emerging voice in the debate about architecture and the contemporary city. So I'm very, very happy to introduce to you today Sarah Gainsforth, who is actually a researcher, independent writer, frequent contributor to journals, magazines. She studied journalism, so she's a journalist. And I came across Sarah's work because, as you know, actually one of my and our interest here, research interest is domestic space. And Sarah has written, in my opinion, among the most provocative reflections on how domestic space today is really at the forefront of the capitalist valorization of the city. So in a way, it goes without saying that today domestic space is a commodity. I mean, it was also in the past, but more than ever, today is a commodity that is actually used not for the needs of dwellers, but for the exchange value, let's say, and the profit of capital. And also, and of course, as you will see, Sarah is really an authority on this topic. And this gives me the opportunity to make one reflection, which is that I saw recently in the work of many students and also in Ancien Théorique, very strong interest to this topic, especially gentrification, which is maybe the most visible phenomenon of this valorization of the city as an asset. But often we, as architects, we tend to look too much to the final result, and we often overlook the mechanism, the process, no? the stakeholders, to use the jargon of today's planning, policy making in the field of planning. And actually, it's interesting that this phenomenon happened when, since the last, I would say, 30 years, planning and urbanism as a discipline has completely disappeared from schools of architecture. At best, we have urban design, but in a way, what used to be really planning, like the study of policies and how they impact the making of the city, is a discipline that is actually gone. I mean, maybe I belong to the very last generation for whom urban geography and planning were very important in the building of the architect know-how. And in fact, it's interesting that this know-how was still based on the welfare state city making. So for us, it was obvious that social housing was the main ingredient to plan cities. But after the mid-90s, late 90s, actually this knowledge completely evaporated, and now we are left only with the tools of architecture in a way. And so it's very important to have you, and it's actually for me interesting that you are not affiliated with a university, so it's very telling how you come from journalism, you know? And this actually may be very important for you as a student, you know? I mean, maybe it's time to reclaim also this point of view, you know? Maybe not just in academia, but also as a form of militant journalism, or journalism that is very committed to a goal that is actually making cities more fair and accessible to all. And I think your work really is, in my opinion, a major contribution to that. So in that sense, I'm really, really happy to welcome you. We will have your presentation, and after we will have a discussion. Thank you, Sarah, and welcome.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, thank you very much. That was a very excellent, great presentation. Yes, I just want to add a few things just about myself. I'm a journalist, basically, so I don't come, in fact, from academia. But actually, my interest in these topics on housing and urban planning arose from direct involvement in community planning, basically, in a neighborhood in Rome where I used to live, San Lorenzo, which is a semi-central neighborhood, where it used to be a very working class neighborhood and then turned student neighborhood with the presence, thanks to the presence of the university. And so I was part of just a citizen group, basically, working on the neighborhood, because it's one of the neighborhoods in Rome which has been most subject to real estate speculation linked to land use issues in the past years. And so I got involved in this kind of negotiation process with the city council. So it was very interesting to see how that really works in practice, and how, unfortunately, the city council does not really negotiate anymore with regard to land use and real estate development. And so that neighborhood is being, I would say, I recently wrote a contribution in a book on San Lorenzo, because people keep referring to San Lorenzo as a gentrified neighborhood, but I actually question that definition, saying maybe we're even past gentrification, because gentrification at least used to better ameliorate public space, the context. It was, neighborhoods became richer for more affluent and more affluent population, whereas this kind of real estate speculation is totally void of context, and so you have buildings springing up inside internal courtyards, for example. So the urban quality, general quality of the neighborhood is just deteriorating. So that's I think is one of the points that's interesting that we might discuss later on. Anyway, so that was the reason why I got interested in these issues. And also I started to notice when I was doing the journalism school, that was 2016-17, the great transformation taking place in the center of Rome with the spread of short-term rentals, basically Airbnb. And at that time there was no data. We had no idea of the true the true nature of this phenomenon. So anyway, I got involved in that, and I contacted Murray Cox, who is an activist, and this is again an activist working on Airbnb, and he basically scrapes the data from the Airbnb website, and then he publishes it on his project, which is called Inside Airbnb. And so he publishes the data as a the claim on his website is providing data for the debate. So we publish the data for Airbnb in Rome, and then since then there have been luckily many studies and much attention given to this topic. So that's how I started investigating these issues, and then I was asked to write a book on housing. So I've written one on Airbnb and one on housing, and I was asked by the editors to write this book, also putting myself in it, which I was kind of allergic to in the beginning, but I have a foreign background. My father is American, my mother is English, so I could put the history of housing policies in those countries in my book with this kind of excuse. And that's what I did. And one of the things I realized writing this book was how, as Pier Vittorio said before, so many crucial issues, which are at the root of the housing question issue, are taboo today, at least in Italy. They're not discussed, they're not public domain, they're given for granted. And so most of the work I did for that book was kind of retelling the story of how this all came to be, of how we got to this point. And this is kind of what I'm going to do with this presentation today, which is going to be kind of very basic, but just to reestablish the basic concepts at the roots of the housing issue, because that's what's been, I think, one of the reasons why we're in the current situation is because after the shift, after the mid-70s, the shift in housing policies, there was also a cultural shift. And so it's important to change the way we think about housing and housing issues as well as policies. So I'm just going to begin with a bit about, just to put the current, the new, I would say, new housing question, which is emerging globally throughout the world. Just to put it into context, I just want to give you some data on this. So I think the easiest way to try and look at what's going on today in various countries is just by starting off by looking at housing prices, the rise of housing prices in recent years. So then, of course, I'm focusing on Europe here. And so in the past decade, housing prices have doubled, rents have increased around 20%. Of course, these are average figures. And then, of course, what happens in the most recent years after the COVID-19 pandemic has been a peak in the number of housing transactions, which you can see in this image. So in 2021 especially, there was a peak in the number of homes being sold and bought, and of course that drove house prices up. The more demand there is, the more the prices go up. But then in 2022, the economic scenario changed with inflation and high interest rates, and so our purchasing power declined, and so that meant there was a shift in the demand from buying to renting a house. I've witnessed this in Italy, but it's something that has been taking place. I mean, even before the pandemic, but the pandemic has kind of just accelerated this trend. So this shift from buying to renting is happening at a time when the rental supply is very, very limited. It has been shrinking over the past decades, over the past years, ultimately also because of the rise of short-term rentals. So we find ourselves in a situation today in which the housing issue is a problem not only for, this is another rhetoric. In Italy, at least, the housing issue has always been presented as something that affects only like the poorest percentage segments of the population. Well, this is not true anymore. I mean, because by now it affects workers with average salaries. And so it is something that is affecting more and more segments of the population, of course, especially young people, foreign people living abroad. But what I find interesting in this figure I wanted to show is when we talk about rates of home ownership, which are quite high in Europe. I mean, in Europe, the average is 69%. In Italy, it's slightly higher. It's generally higher in Eastern and Southern European countries. But when we look at, because generally what we only see is, rates, percentages of families owning and percentages of families renting. But it's interesting to compare, the percentage of families who are actually paying a mortgage. And so then we find out that countries with the highest percentage of owners display the highest percentage of outright ownership, which means that ownership has been achieved in the past. It's been achieved in different economic conditions when the gap between housing costs and income was not as high as it is today. And also home ownership was achieved also thanks to public policies, public spending, and many measures that promoted home ownership and made that possible. And so Italy, for example, here, it's here in the middle, has a very high rate of outright ownership, which reflects the demographic composition of the population. It's one of the oldest countries in the world. And so only 15% of families are paying a mortgage in this given year, which I think is it's 2020. So only 15%, which is a lot less than 25% families who are actually renting. But there are no public policies for families renting, while there are for people buying homes. Anyway, this is just to say that this home ownership issue, I think, is the narrative used to be, that home ownership would prevent, poverty. It's a safeguard against poverty. Well, that's not true anymore. And that growth of home ownership was thanks to public policies, has taken place in the past, and more people today are excluded. So especially young people increasingly living with their parents. And that population, is of course the renting population faces higher costs, higher costs even compared to income. The threshold should be 30%. We shouldn't be paying more than 30% of our income in housing costs, but of course that's seldom the case, especially in cities. These are average figures. I mean, in cities, those would probably be even higher. So this is just to put the issue into context. And so I think it's interesting to now to go back in time. And again, I'll probably be saying things that should be, obvious and well known and common knowledge, but maybe not. So I'm just gonna go through them again, because I think this is what we were talking about before. We don't realize the political dimension of housing. That's what's been lost in the shift since the 70s. The whole cultural, political dimension, which has to do with cities, with the way we live. It has to do with collective values. And that's been kind of put to the side by a cultural shift focusing on the importance of private property and home ownership. So I think the first thing, to do is to place housing policies, planning policies, within the context of urbanization, of the growth of cities, which took place with the economic, processes of industrialization. So that's all very closely linked together. And at a time when there was no public state or local regulation of private property, which of course then gave rise to the housing conditions described by Engels in Manchester in the 19th century, conditions which were, of course, so bad, driven by speculation by landlords, which resulted in public health issues. So the fact that the origin, the beginning of housing policies is linked to issues of public health and hygiene, I think is very important to comment on, because this means this is the first time in history when private property becomes limited by state intervention. The city council intervenes and orders what we call, today what we give for granted, but what's outside that, what's in public space, what's in the collective space beyond homes, beyond houses, that's the city. So cities as collective space need to regulate private property, and that was the beginning of this process in the 19th century, and the beginning of regulation and planning, which grew, of course, in the 30s and especially after the Second World War, and also as a planning as a political tool, I think, led to the emerging of millions of people from poverty. This is, something we might tend to forget, but that was the aim often of policies promoted also often by conservative members of parliament. For example, in England, in Italy, Beveridge was conservative. In Italy, we had Fiorentino Sullo, who was campaigning for the regulation of land use, and he was a conservative. And so these measures were aimed at ameliorating the living conditions of the many. And I think it's interesting to go back and read what those politicians were campaigning for, because since then there's been this huge shift to the right. And so I just wanted to mention a few, I think, very fundamental steps in this rise of planning culture. The Planning Act of 1947. I keep mixing dates up in my book. Yes, it's 1947, where building rights were nationalized. Because of course, what are we talking about when we talk about the housing issue, housing rights, the housing question? We're talking basically about land. We're talking about land use, and this is one of the things that has been kind of removed from the public debate. But that was very clear in those years after the Second World War. And so I think it's particularly the British legislation from those years was very, very advanced. And that, of course, since then has been totally dismantled. But the nationalization of building permits separated ownership of the land from the right to build, basically. You have to ask for a permit. I mean, we kind of give this for granted today, but it wasn't the case then. And that was, in Italy, this issue has been it's been much more confused. There are court cases and court rulings, and then in 1980 there was a famous court ruling which decided that no, in Italy the right to build and the ownership of the land are the same thing, which was meant kind of the end of public planning, because city councils have no tools then, after this court sentencing, they don't really have the means to negotiate with private landowners. So anyway, going back to this topic, what we're talking about is the value of land. which determine house prices. And what I think we must remember is that the value of land is socially generated, is socially produced. It's, why is a home worth more at the Colosseum, than in an area on the outskirts of Rome? It has to do with economic processes of agglomeration. That's why cities expand and form and attract new inhabitants. It has to do with cultural heritage, like I was saying before, monuments which are collective, public heritage, and also, of course, with planning regimes, because the public can regulate land use, and so it can determine the kind of value that it can create. And it does create value just by, for example, infrastructures, building railway stations, and of course the value of homes increases. So the fact that this value is socially, collectively produced, I think is important to note at a time when we've kind of gone back to a cultural atmosphere in which private property is once again considered to be the key factor driving the economy. So the whole issue is about how to regulate urban land value and how to distribute this value, and who creates it and who captures it. This is just basically to put it simply. And of course, these regimes of regulation are what should regulate who captures this land value. And so before this shift, neoliberal shift that took place in the 70s, that's what public policies were doing. They were implementing measures such as a tax of betterment. This is still the UK, for example. The city council could buy land from private owners at a low price, an agricultural price. So not at an enhanced value, and then it could better this land by building infrastructure on it. Then it could sell the land again to private owners who had to pay a betterment tax because public intervention had enhanced the value of the land. So these are all concepts that today are they're very, at least in Italy, there are differences within countries in Europe, of course, but in Italy, our current kind of regime of regulation is all in favor of private development, and in exchange for private development on public land, there's very little which is returned, which is giving back also in terms of taxes to the city council, so to collective sphere. Anyway, so this regulation, of course, was not the only means of redistributing this value. Of course, we know there was a huge effort in creating public housing, social housing, and other means of housing with different cooperative housing, for example, was another form which guaranteed the right to housing and housing as a need to people emerging from poverty. This, we know, ended basically, it started in the United States in the late 70s. There was a shift from financing public housing to subsidizing the private rental market, basically. So there was an end of policies investing in public housing, which, by the way, one of the other measures introduced in the UK in 1949 was, I think is interesting, was the abolishment, I think, of any kind of limit to access council housing. So that meant council housing in England, there was a time when it was a universal measure. Anybody could live in council housing. This is also something my mother told me. It was not a residual kind of housing just for poor people. That happened, also as a cultural shift from the 70s when public housing started to be dismantled. But up until then, I mean, there was even culturally just public housing was just an alternative to privately built and sold and rented housing. But so this shift takes place, and the dismantling of the welfare state and the welfare policies on all levels, not only with regard to housing, but of course in many other aspects of the economic life of cities and countries, with privatizations, the deregulation, and so on. And Piketty speaks of a systemic collapse, basically. And this is another interesting statement. You may know Madden and Marcuse are two authors who wrote this really interesting book on the housing crisis. And they point out the housing crisis today is a structural crisis. It's not an exception. It's not something that is an error. It's structural to this system, which was implemented from the 70s on, and then in the 80s, especially in the 80s, in Italy, I must say. And so, of course, this brought to the rise again of inequality, and one of the reasons for the emergence of welfare policies, housing policies, was the extreme level of inequality which had been reached before World War I in Europe. It's interesting. I really love to read Piketty's book because I like to see those figures. I mean, when he talks about, for example, this is one example in Paris in 1914. The richest decile of the population owned 90% of the property. I mean, these are impressive figures. The problem is we're going back to that, and you can see it in this figure on the right, where we can see how the percentage of wealth held by the 1% went down from the 30s, 40s, 50s, thanks to progressive taxation, while the bottom 90% gained percentages of wealth. And now, of course, since the 70s, this is reversing. This is going the other way around. So actually, we are going back to a situation of extreme inequality. And this is something else we have to point out about the role of the state, because we tend to think, even when I'm speaking, and especially in Italy lectures, and Italy's the state, I would say, has followed like the classic shift that came from the States and then went through the UK, and then it came, so shifting the funding from the public sector to the private market, abolishing rent control, promoting home ownership funding, all these measures, making one of the ways home ownership also was promoted was just to make it harder to rent. So selling, reducing the rental stock of housing, so selling public housing, selling what would have been social housing in Italy, all that is being sold off. And so the only two measures which were left in Italy, but I think this is quite common, were subsidies, of course, for the private rental market, which, by the way, it's interesting to know, to look at figures once again. For example, in England, the state has, since Margaret Thatcher's Right to Buy program, has sold off a great percentage of public housing. But meantime, it has spent a lot more money on private rental subsidies than what it has gained from the sale of public housing. And so that makes it evident that it's not about money. It's not because the narrative was, the public is inefficient, it's too expensive. Well, that's not the case, because the figures show that the state is actually today spending a lot more on private rental subsidies than it would have spent on public housing. And so it's actually an ideological choice. And so in Italy we had this subsidy, and there were two subsidies for the private rental housing, and this government has not renewed these subsidies. So actually now today in Italy there are no measures on housing whatsoever, despite the increase in housing insecurity. And so we tend to say, there are no housing policies, the state, is absent. Well, that's not the case, because no housing policies is a policy in itself, actually. And so, as Marcuse points out, actually, it's not a reduction in the role of the state. It's just a shift in the role of the state from public housing, for example, to private rental subsidies. And today I'm following very closely in Italy the National Recovery Resilience Plan, because it does have some measures for housing, and specifically for student housing. But it's basically, again, it's subsidizing private owners and developers of private student housing, which then rent units at incredibly high costs. I mean, they're higher than market rate rents, and so we're pouring our national recovery resilience funds into this kind of operation. So that makes it so evident how the state has not disappeared, but it has been. I think it's also been kind of conquered by interests which are not public interests. So anyway, these regulatory transformations, of course, paved the way to all this change in the housing sector, the rise of the mortgage market, deregulation of the private rental market across Europe, rent control. There is still rent control in some countries, but specifically in southern European countries, it's been the market has been liberalized, and housing financialization. So just a bit about financialization is what the process in which housing has become an asset, basically. In Italy and in southern European countries, home ownership has always been very high, but it was kind of a means of welfare, of familistic welfare. So homes were passed on through generations. So despite having these high rates of home ownership, homes were not viewed as assets. They were not viewed to be sold. They were viewed to be passed on through generations. And so this changed, thanks to shifts in the regulatory framework, especially in the 90s. The government made it difficult to rent, but then at the same time expanded access to credit, so spurring the housing market, the number of transactions, and so house prices really increased, especially after the year 2000, and increased 40%. Of course, all this it's hard to, because in my book I'm writing about these issues, and then my mother asked me, she said, but when did housing exactly become an asset? Because that's, and I think I figured out, at least in Italy, that was, like in 1996, I could say, okay, that year is because the state introduced a series of legislative reforms on, especially on the for the mortgage market. So that point is quite evident how state regulation determines housing financialization. I'll skip this, I think. And what we're dealing with today, not so much in Southern Europe, but in Northern Europe, is, of course, the rise of institutional investors, as they call them. So not just families, of course, owning a home to live in, but housing as an asset being used basically for operations as a collateral, just to park capital, basically. And that's why we have so many empty homes. And it strikes me how these, again, I think these processes should be well known, but again and again in the public media debate, at least in Italy, I keep hearing about the proposal just to build new homes. Well, in Italy, 30% of all the homes are empty. Of course, there are great differences among regions, among urban settings, countryside, whatever. But that's a huge amount of empty homes. And so the fact that people keep proposing to build new homes as a solution for the housing issue is unacceptable, because the root of the problem is housing as an asset. And so until housing as an asset is, is not questioned, this kind of cultural mentality, we won't be able to solve the housing crisis. So this is basically what's going on, especially in the United States, institutional owners buying up huge amounts of housing stock, and then basically raising rents. We saw this especially before 2008, but also afterwards. This has a huge impact on cities, of course. This is the cover of a book which I really, really liked, by Samuel Stein. I think he coined a very interesting term. He calls what we live in, he calls it the real estate state. Basically, with the change, the shift, the economic shift from industrialization to the restructuring of urban economies, especially with different sectors, cultural sectors. The real estate sector has become more and more central, and so actually cities are not the locus of factories, of the production of commodities and services, but they are the product itself. So that especially since cities have stopped expanding, physically expanding, and we have to, we talk about regenerating city centers, places that have changed functions, have lost functions, like railway yards, like factory sites. These places are being regenerated to enhance once again the land value, and so the construction of the city is the business itself. This is basically what Stein points out so well in this book, as written by. I mean, he's a city planner, so he knows what he's talking about. And so the redevelopment of all these city urban voids is transforming more and more cities into exclusive, basically, areas where the resident population is being pushed out. But this is not the only change taking place. With the, I would say, the emergence of tourism, but not only. I think today we're seeing new mobility patterns, but they're quite difficult to read. So the emergence of new temporary populations. I think maybe the main difference between the two periods before the pandemic and after, if we want to kind of draw a line there, is I think these kinds of temporary populations are more and more blurred, but I think that's happening because of the real estate market, which is not distinguishing anymore clearly between students, tourists, temporary workers, because it's creating a new kind of offer which caters to all these different categories of temporary inhabitants, kind of indistinctly. I think it was interesting. There's one of the major real estate private operators who runs student accommodation recently changed its name from Student Hotel to the Social Hub. And I think that's indicative of saying there's the boundaries between these temporary users, I call them city users, like Martinotti. Martinotti coined the phrase city users back in the 90s, are more and more blurred. This is an interesting quote because, I mean, he was quite prescient in writing in the 90s how temporary populations in cities would probably grow and maybe even outgrow stable residents. And so indeed that is actually what is happening, at least in city centers across the world. And so this is today is what is driving the rent gap, the difference, the differential in land value. Basically, it can be enhanced by development of housing for this specific segment of the population, and this is what is, I think, exacerbating the housing crisis, especially in countries and cities who do not have basically any alternative, any public housing alternative, because actually the ordinary rental market is disappearing in Italy, at least in the most touristic cities like in Florence, but also in other cities like Bologna, which never used to be so touristic. Agencies are not dealing long-term rentals anymore. So we're witnessing a profound change within the private rental market, but the regulation, the laws regulating the private market still date back to the 90s. so they're obsolete. And I think this is, I just threw this in because this is Airbnb in Rome, the data we published with Murray Cox. And when I was investigating, this is actually...
Yeah, you can't Airbnb in the Vatican. There's one, yeah.
It's the middle of the park of Vatican City.
And so when that was for me, when I was looking into Airbnb, I said, it's not possible, there's no data. We have to have data to understand what's going on, what kind of process is changing the city center. And so now we have basically all these are just Airbnb listings, and of course half of them are in the most central areas, and of course they're all entire apartments. There's lots of multi-hosts who have more than one listing and so on. And basically what I think is that we might be undergoing the same kind of process today with mid-term rentals. So it's not just Airbnb, it's also other digital platforms and digital property managers who are taking up rental housing, but it's not short-term anymore, it's like months or a year maybe for workers, students, but we have no data on this. And so I think there's the risk, that we're going to wake up. There are studies on this already. I mean, there are studies, for example, a researcher called Agustin Coppola-Gant in Portugal is studying this. So there is some data. But this is, I think, a trend that, especially in Italy, is ignored basically by many, by the media, by politicians. And we're still not regulating short-term rentals. And so I wonder, I keep wondering when I read about how, especially the Italian media, how there are new preferences regarding mobility, housing, living. I keep wondering, I mean, how much are these patterns induced by the real estate markets? I mean, how much are they induced by the offer on the markets, and how much are they actually led by people wanting to travel more, wanting to study for a year here and then live over there? One researcher calls it multi-local living, seems to be on the rise, people living in different places, commuting more. I think this is an interesting topic I would like to research more, because we don't have any data. Because especially in, things are better maybe in the UK. I see they have different ways of capturing mobility and how public space is impacted by increased mobility. But otherwise, very often all our policies are still based on residency. And I think this is an obsolete criteria to continue to base policies on. So this is what I'm kind of wondering. How can we read these new mobility patterns? What data can we use? What's their effects? And of course, I think these might be new trends, but I think the answers to the housing issues question generated by these new mobility trends are the old ones. I still believe the real issue is regulation, is regulating land use and regulating housing, basically. And this is, I put this right at the end, about gentrification, because when we do like public talks, often there is still kind of the thought that gentrification is due to artists going to such and such a neighborhood and gentrifying it. Well, that's not the issue. I mean, it's not the people gentrifying. It's it's capital coming in and gentrifying a neighborhood. And so I don't think the answer to these processes generated by mobility would be to block mobility. I don't think the problem are the people. Call them whatever you want. Call them digital nomads. Call them that's a new buzzword. I think the problem is regulation, and that's also the case. But that's always been the case because housing values are enhanced by the use of the land. And so by the types of people living there are enhanced by the conditions that make the land livable. So public creation of infrastructure, public amelioration of space, but that has to be possible without producing gentrification and expulsion. So I think that's the very basic question. I mean, I think that's and also the very basic solution, which can be declined in with various means and instruments and long-term and short-term policies regulating housing. But I think what policymakers understood already at the beginning of the 20th century, I think, is still valid today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for this wonderful presentation, which I think, I mean, as you said at the beginning, it's really like the foundations, of planning. But I think it was very useful for all of us to go through all these points, and I think there are also some very useful, at least from my point of view, point that you make, which is something very close to many discourse and discussions we had also as architects, which is this emerging, let's say, population of temporary users, because many of us belong to to that category. And actually, I've even witnessed sometimes tensions between, in London actually, like when you move to like a working class neighborhood, because it's the only place where you can afford to rent a place. The so-called local people look at you very like, okay, this guy's going to gentrify us. So in a way, and I think what you said for me is really important, because I think there is a lot of leftist discourse who you really use you are a gentrifier. You are just coming here, you are exploiting the atmosphere, and then and I think what you said for me is really important, because the problem is not the people. I mean, actually, temporary use for me is very important and gives people freedom to work and live where they would like to do. Of course, the question is whether this is an induced habit or is really a choice. But I think what you said for me is very important, that what we have to understand is the mechanism that parasite those patterns and use them to valorize certain places. And I think this is really important for, actually, I think, when we do these projects about collective housing, cooperative housing, or, houses for students I think it's very important to understand that behind our project, there is this mechanism. And until we do not convince the municipality, the city to take measures, I think we can do a wonderful project that works very well, but it will fail because these regulations actually will turn this project into something different. So how what kind of activism you see today able to confront this problem of regulations? No? I mean, did you see any situation, I don't know, in Rome or where you live and work, where a group of people, activists, are really aware of this mechanism and is really bargain, how the city is running them. I mean, is there any possibility for people or architects or planners or urbanists to really change those regulations?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I want to make the example now of Milan because Italy actually does not suffer such a big pressure by financialization. But Milan is kind of an exception. It's more like in the European context where housing prices have skyrocketed because in Italy they kind of dropped after the financial crisis in 2008. But in Milan it's different. And so Milan, even though it's not the only city today, but it is having a problem now, of course, like cities are having problems of attracting essential workers, basically, because the gap between incomes and housing costs is so wide. And so there has been finally debate, public debate about this. And in Milan, I think a good example of activism is this group. It's called Abitare in Via Padova, which is it's localized, is set in this neighborhood, kind of gentrifying neighborhood where many foreigners also live. And I think they're very, very good also because within this group there are actually people who are also in academia, professors, planners, urbanists, and so they know really well, they know what they're talking about. And they're doing an excellent job of dissemination of, identifying what the problem is. So for example, one of the squares will be renovated by the public, the city council. And this, of course, has already generated, the increase of the housing values. And so people who live around this square are being, phoned up by real estate guys, offering to buy the house because what the city council is doing is having an effect, that's on their values, and so they're denouncing this. They're demanding, and they're saying, the issue here is not to, not carry out renovation work. The solution here is to regulate rents, is to regulate the markets, the housing markets. And so they're doing this kind of dissemination work, which I think is very important because they're finally bringing these issues into the public domain, public debate, and they're denouncing the sale of public housing. And then finally in Italy something seems to be happening because there will be like this national meeting finally in April. Because there are many groups and collectives and in each city, but finally they're going to come together. So I think this is an interesting moment where these things are starting to be discussed again publicly. We'll see. Yeah.
Alfredo, yes, please.
No, thank you. This was great, and I have. Two-part question. One more at the core of what you were discussing and something that perhaps throws the ball in a slightly different direction. We have Engels' text rather fresh in mind because we discussed it, I think, last week with our students or something. There's a funny dimension to the text. Now, the poor Proudhon gets all the blame for offering regulations which according to Engels are rather superficial. No? It's like you are just trying to fix, the wrong part of the problem. No? And I mean, I live half of my life. I'm one of these people. I'm not sure if I'm a tourist or a student. I'm not, that's for sure. But in Berlin, and how the left has managed to regulate the market. I really feel like we inhabit in Proudhon land, very superficial regulations that to a certain point only manage to make the problem worse. So, for example, the cap on rent means that everything goes on the black market. The only ones who have access to this is this new population of very short-term rentals because the regulation can trap them. So yeah, then the question for me is more, again, if we hedonists are, we miss the side where the carrot really is, who is making the horse run. And I think, at least in the case of Berlin, is clearly a different kind of industry that, as you said, is enhancing a kind of population that is very difficult to trap, at least according to normal regulation. So my question is there, if the regulation of housing, and I think this is perhaps what you're trying to induce with the talk too, is the final output of a series of measurements that need to be considered way before, because again, housing is the final link of a chain of decisions that were made a while before. So that's one part of the question. The second one has to do with, I think it's very interesting to hear you from a journalist perspective, because I think you guys trap trends or breaks way quicker than us. We're very slow. That something changed around 2020 with the pandemic. And at least what I've been observing is that, the urban center got a certain state of saturation, and things of course keep raising, and it would be wishful thinking to think that we got to such a bad state that it cannot get any worse. I mean, things can always get worse, but it reached a certain kind of bad stability, but the new frontier is clearly the countryside. So we learn all these critical tools, but we arrive a bit late to the party, so there isn't much we can do. But now we're seeing the new frontier really. So these same curves that we're seeing now, if we transport them to the countryside because of the means of work, that it's now, it's not in London or in Berlin, but it's somewhere in the countryside in Portugal, close to seasides. It's a different kind of phenomenon. What is being radically transformed in terms of also financial. So this is the second part of my question. If we perhaps said, okay, we fucked it up with the cities, we arrive a bit too late, but now can we look at this other phenomenon which is happening right now, and maybe we are not late to regulate that one?
Yeah, that's super interesting. In fact, I myself am working on this, also with a research project and in other ways on what we call inner areas in Italy. Also because I realized, again, there's no data. It's very difficult to understand what's going on. So I think this is one issue. It's not only regulating housing, it's also confronting this issue. Data is being privatized, like cell phone data. I mean, that's our data. That should be made available for research, for example. All these. So that is that's part of the picture, the privatization of data, and so I think that's a huge problem. I'm very interested in this in these topics because I used to kind of think with this dichotomy: resident, tourist, residents are good, tourists are bad. But then I realized that is kind of maybe an urban dichotomy. And so when you go outside of cities, mobility, at least in Italy, mobility used to be very, very common. People used to work and reside in different places in different periods of the year. And so I began to be interested in this issue and also in these new mobility patterns. And so as a journalist, I just kind of did some research and interviewed people. There are a lot of young people moving out of, for example, Bologna in the north of Italy because it's become so expensive. And so they're moving out into the towns, on the hills. But of course, they're encountering the same issues because there's no rental housing there. It's either owners who want to sell they're not interested in renting, or it's tourist rentals. And so actually, people in cities tend to have this very urban view of thinking, as soon as you move out of the city, well, there's availability. Well, it's not true. So there is a class selection, it's just there. And so that's, I think, that's going to be, I think one of the major directions of research in these years, because on the one hand, as we were saying, there's not much data to read what's going on. On the other hand, there's going to be kind of a race to the best places with climate change also, I think. And so there is, I think, also this tendency to kind of think, okay, maybe we're still in time to kind of put in place, for example, I'm working on a project, trying to promote public acquisition, so the acquisition by city councils of homes in rural areas, for example, in small towns. Because in Italy, I'm not sure if this is the case in other countries in the rest of Europe, but there's these programs where they sell homes for €1.
Yeah.
€1, which many researchers I know are totally against, and I agree. So, in that kind of a situation, I mean, you would have to kind of, not everywhere, but figure out where maybe you could, I think, start policies for public acquisition of homes and restructuring of homes, and then, and I think that I'm talking to these administrations, there's not much awareness of this yet. They're not aware of the importance of having public stock, of having a rental stock. It's all about buying and selling now. So I think that is I think that's a very interesting issue. Yeah.
Nicola,
First of all, thank a lot, and thank for my colleague that invited you. Thank a lot for your depiction of the Italian situation. It is doped a lot by the cooperative fake system that deregulate the market and they regulate everything thanks to a very, very old law. But I have another question that maybe needs a political answer. I spent a third of my life as owner in Italy, then a third as I was tenant in Germany, and then now I've got a mortgage here in Switzerland, giving the money to the bank.
Wow.
The first part I gave the money to the state, and the second part as tenant I gave the money to the private owner. And there are three different situations as inhabitant. I don't ask you which one is better, because that depends which one state we have, which one owner, which one back. Can we go out? Yes, the 10% I was squatter, but I think that is not a solution for everybody. But my difficult question is, how can we regulate countries and population as maybe not impossible, but unuseful to regulate? And how can we enter in a so complicated system with so different government that each may be 5 years or 4 years, that depends. Here in Switzerland, a lot of big cities remains for 35, 50 years in the same governance. But in France or in Italy, each 4 years is a very strong alternance. How can we imagine a short-term system to regulate this one? Because there is one line, but the other one, it's complicated, because build a social housing, it's 10 years. Here in Switzerland, and in France and Italy more. In Switzerland, it's a medium time starting from the financing and the competition arriving to the first people that go in, it's 10 years. So this is, how can you imagine to regulate?
No, I think, but also partly to answer the question before, I mean, I think, of course, I tend to have in mind Italy, which is quite different, I mean, because Italy has no kind of, real social housing, for example. So, and I'm aware there are different countries, like Spain has various measures, Barcelona, and various types of regulations are in place in Europe, for example, the rental markets, and they work and they don't work, and so nothing is perfect. There's a housing crisis everywhere, but at least I think, at least other countries are trying. You may try a measure and see, it doesn't work, and you can correct it, and you can. Whereas in Italy, we're not even trying, basically. But I think in terms of regulation, specifically thinking about Italy. I could imagine a variety of things that could be done. But the issue is, because I didn't talk much about it, but the measure, the National Recovery and Resilience Plan measure for student housing is, when you look at it, that specific example, it's so obvious that something else could have been done. We're talking about over 1 billion euros, which are going to finance the creation of 60,000 student housing units in Italy. Okay, there's not much time because that has to be done, within 2026. But now we've already lost, years. But that could have been money kind of spent for a structural solution given to public entities for restructuring, for example, all these public empty spaces there are in Italy. We keep talking about the caserme, how do you call this? We have them for years and years and years, and they're still empty, and nothing's been done with them. So things I think could have been done, but there I see the precise intention of and it's written in the national plan. The first version of the plan mentioned the right to study, and in the final version of the approved plan that was taken out. And the aim of this measure is to support private investments. So that is just black on white. And that's what they're doing. They're supporting private investments for the first 3 years, and then we don't know what. That's not a structural measure, because that housing, and in fact, I think it's interesting, one of the criteria is to build or to regenerate buildings providing single rooms, not double rooms, which were the majority up until now. And I think that's also because then they can be more easily converted into hotel rooms, basically. And so there are lots of indicators of this trend where I think the state is just basically in a role of supporting private investors. And so in Italy, we joke, we say we don't even really have capitalism, because the market by itself just doesn't work. And so it continually needs to be propped up by public funding. But that's very Italian case, I think. I think it's different. I'm sure it's different in other European countries. But so that, in Italy, that's what I wanted to say. I'd just start by looking at what the real aim of these policies, what the real aim is. And of course, I don't think there's one solution for solving the housing crisis, but at least, the countries, you can have maybe a combination of measures which might make some difference. There was a recent study by a geographer, an Italian geographer, Filippo Celata, who they examined all the regulations put in place for regulating short-term rentals in Europe, and they found that these regulations had actually resulted in an increase of the rental stock in these countries by 30% compared to countries that have no regulation in place. So something that was interesting to know. Regulations do produce some effects.
Thank you, Sarah, for the beautiful presentation. I wanted to ask something following what you just said. If I think about the history of San Francisco, around the beginning of the 20th century, when regulations came in place regarding SRO, the single room occupancy, they immediately declined. Like in the following decades, these types of dwellings stopped being built, and at some point they started demolishing them. They weren't trendy anymore, of course, and one could trace other, let's say, phenomenon similar to Airbnbs in the past. Do you think that maybe these regulations may bring Airbnb to an end?
I don't know. It depends. I don't know if they. I think it was interesting. One of these studies done by Murray Cox of Inside Airbnb was on the negotiation capacity by city councils, basically, and so he classified city councils according to the types of regulation, if they were strong, or if they were weak, or if they were so I think I don't know if regulations can solve the problems. I think there'll always be we'll always be like chasing, even the idea that planning can actually, come before in Italy that was true. I mean, cities were built before, planning could, get to regulate what was being built. So that is kind of a utopia. But I think it's important to. That's why I was talking about data before. The thing is, to have the means to be able to and the resources. I mean, if states wanted to, they could have the resources and the tools to be able to read. I mean, one of the problems is, we arrive, years after something's happened, and so that's a big issue. And there was a really interesting book also published by Verso book, which came out, I think it was the same period as Stein's Capital City, which is about planning, and it's interesting because it says there are so many voices against planning, saying, it's old, urban planning is an old idea. And he says, well, actually, I mean, if you look at Amazon, if you look at Walmart, if you look at all these huge private platforms and corporations and multinationals, it's all about planning. Yeah. I mean, their capacity to plan is what is at the base of their huge power and wealth, and so he says, this thing of that planning is old has never been so.
Actually, in fact, one could argue that the origins of planning were, in fact, actually planning was born within the milieu of private development. Actually. Is really the discipline that emerged after the enclosures of common land, when actually the landowners have to survey and then build infrastructures, build roads to valorize their property. And then actually only after, in the late 19th century, this know-how was in fact taken by the reformers, like state officials, who twist actually planning for the public good. But I have to say that this is for me the dilemma I have myself, because it's true. I mean, I completely agree that there is a whole rhetoric against planning, which certainly has a neoliberal regions. It's a way to delegitimize the state. But first of all, within neoliberalism, there is a lot of planning.
Yeah.
Actually, I would say in the last maybe 40 years, we had an hypertrophic production of planning. For example, there is a lot of regulatory planning being done at the moment, and actually there is also a lot of mechanisms through which these plans are constantly updated.
Yeah.
So there is never like a final plan. In fact, planning is is really exactly like that. It's never ends,
Yeah,
no?
True.
And it's true that I have a dilemma because in a way, planning. I mean, on one hand, I don't want to side with this rhetoric, of the neoliberal critique of planning. At the same time, planning has always been a form of dispossession of communities, even in the best term, even in the welfare state where planning was, made certainly not in favor of capital, but somehow it was a form of dispossession of communities. And in fact, there is a lot of critique of planning during the welfare state by anarchists, which now, when you read it now, you think, oh, these are where the harbingers of the libertarians or but it's somehow I have a dilemma. I mean, I'm not sure planning can be, as in the book you mentioned, reclaim as a sort of, baggage with no bad things inside, let's say, because planning is really based on the separation between communities and their possibilities to self and organize, self-transform themselves.
No, that's fine. I've always been, in fact, accused of being like a state advocate for the state. No, I think. I too have the same kind of dilemma, but I also think, looking at, of course, housing legislation was the result of struggles. It's not that it just came from above, and it was not. Like I said, in Italy, that was the case. Protests, mass protests. And I also think it's easier to think of planning in terms of concrete examples. When I say planning, I mean like land use planning. And so in Italy, for example, we have all these urban master plans, which are super outdated. I mean, they're from the 60s, and so they envisage, growth in population while population is declining, nobody's dealing with that. They're not, they can't touch that. And for example, I wrote about Bari, which was an interesting case because Bari had a city official, the assessora, who was working with community groups who were doing, self-management of spaces and regenerating places. And so she had this vision where these actions were to be like, they were to guide the whole planning, the revision of this master plan. I'm not going to go into detail now. And so that was like a really interesting approach she had, and she said, these experiences have to emerge. They have to change how the city works, how the city administration works. Otherwise, they're just, what we call best practices, which don't change the system. And so she had that very clear in mind. And she was working on the new master plan, which meant working on land use. And so interfering with, the construction rights that people hold. And of course, what happened that her master plan was just locked away, like a sitter put away and forgot, and it was never approved. And so the city is doing loads of work regenerating squares and places and parks and everything, all these wonderful projects, but without without touching the general master plan of the city, and so I thought that was really interesting too. I don't know if I'm answering, but
Thank you for the talk. It was really enjoyable. And there's two paradoxes that you highlighted that I love, which is just real estate as an asset. In a way, you can invest in a real estate fund, index fund, and you can basically bet that the market is going to go up, and it's always going to go up. And the Airbnb-ification, in which basically just reinforces the fact that real estate is an asset, but also they market themselves as a community at every chance that they have. My question is on the other side of the Atlantic. Taking New York City, there's two regulations that I want to highlight. There's one that was targeting Airbnbs and the length of rent that you're able to rent out, which was met with extreme backlash because some people were depending on that income to be able to afford their mortgage to begin with, especially with variable interest rates. So there's the little person that gets hit by the regulation, whereas on the opposite side, there's the second regulation, which rent control has led to extreme vacancy because it's actually cheaper for a lot of the real estate owners to just leave them vacant and not maintain them and wait until it either gets lifted or have tenants in there. So my question was more so like in the face of a lack of potency of regulation in this case, what do you think of examples like community land trusts? For example, in Toronto, Kensington Market or like Kensington is starting to grow as a community land trust, basically defending itself through gentrification. What is your opinion of this kind of like more ground up, play the game that the investors play approach that's maybe a little bit more anarchist?
I really love that. Yes, that kind of approach. I think it's very interesting. It made me think also of what we were talking about before, small towns and inner areas where I see there's just the ability to experiment more, and so there are very interesting things going on with different. In Italian, we call them cooperatives. Basically, people get together in cooperatives, and they work together with the city council in these small towns on projects that have a public aim, public interest, but they can use the tools of the cooperative, and so I think these experiences I think are really interesting, and in a certain way I think they can't. I don't know about making a difference on an absolute number on that kind of scale, on a big scale, but I think as models. I think they're very interesting. I think that, and then I also think, but on the topic of vacancy, on the topic of Airbnb, I think basically that just highlights how much things are interconnected and how issues are. I always think, in Italy, we have no kind of welfare measure for income. We did, and then that was abolished. The reddito di cittadinanza, and so of course I think that comes into the picture because I know there are people renting on Airbnb because they don't have income from labor, from work, but that just shows you how much you need some kind of welfare means there, otherwise you're using housing as a privatized welfare system, which is then what then makes it worse for everybody else. So that's why it's so difficult to deal with Airbnb. But on vacancy, I think also there should be some kind of of regulation there on. But I think it's interesting because in Italy there's been a start of a debate on this. beginning with commercial spaces, because there are so many commercial spaces that are empty. I mean, especially after the pandemic, and owners just keeping these really super high rents. And that's more the impact on the quality of life in cities more evident when it's commercial spaces, because you can see them, because you see all these empty streets and empty roads. And so even kind of conservative organizations started to, to question if they have the right to, to ask these high rents and to keep these spaces empty, because that is, it's impacting the whole city. And so I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. Maybe, if the discourse started from commercial spaces, then it could maybe be, spread to residential spaces as well. Which, of course, we know vacancy has that impact on cities.
I can also add observation concerning, beside the question of regulation, I would also perhaps put on the level of the discussion also the question of mentalities that needs to be questioned. After 2008, the crisis of debt in 2008, what we immediately saw was the start of the decline of the middle class, basically, crisis, which coincided also with the housing question that started to happen after that. Which to a certain extent, I would argue that this actually decline of the middle class in terms of mentality probably was even a positive thing, considering that it also gave birth to the rise of these figures and subjects and subjectivities that you collect here, like students, artists, and so on, that were called knowledge workers, if we can use this generic term, but also precarious workers, that to a certain extent, in that period, that I would say between 2008 till 2015, 16, still could claim a certain, let's say, it was, let's say, a subjectivity that was full of potentials to a certain extent. It could claim also a position of class, or a class, let's say, could claim, yes, belonging to a class, no? But then again, what you also argue with the rise of Airbnb and also the help that the municipalities, they are using a lot. On the contrary, it seems to me that there is an attempt to go back to the middle class and to inject a middle class mentalities. For example, I come from Tirana. Tirana belongs to a socialist country, which most of the housing stock was, as you showed in the examples, only before, during socialist, let's say, period. So then what happens is that the middle class is gaining somehow a sort of economical autonomy by renting through Airbnb there. But at the same time, the paradoxical side of it is that at the same time, the city is also trying to push on the outskirts the middle class families. So this is a paradoxical side of it. On the one hand, there is this moment where we, as students, artists, I'm pretty would not have any problem to call myself a student, to a certain extent. So students in a way represented a class position, and it still represents a class position. But then with the mentality that is produced by these cities and by this phenomena that you also argue today in your book on Airbnb especially, it seems to me that this moment, this triumphal moment of our condition as class, started to disappear, because now the mentality of the middle class is the one when we have to look, especially when we talk in terms of housing questions and so on. So I wonder what you think about this.
No, so I agree. I think I was reading an Italian sociologist recently on this issue, because he was talking about the intellectual left urban class, and many of whom rent on Airbnb, and so this is kind of. He was pointing out the fact that they don't have a class consciousness, basically, because there are mechanisms such as home ownership and such as Airbnb that are hiding the true, level of impoverishment. And so he was arguing that, in fact, they can just forestall, that these material problems, they don't appear to have because of home ownership. Whereas if they actually, so they don't feel, as poor. So there's a great fear of not being middle class anymore in a certain way, in this kind of sphere of people. And so I found that interesting because I was thinking, maybe if they realize, actually they are poor because of income, not because of housing, then maybe we could actually do something about it, and we could do something about the state of low incomes, high cost of housing, and whatsoever. And so on the one hand, yes, I do think of these people as a class, but I think I don't think there's much awareness in this group of citizens as being a class. I wonder, because,
Yeah, you can say that, this system is of Airbnb plus municipalities and the ideology of owning and selling, renting a house. Because you might have, among colleagues who belong to different class backgrounds, to a certain extent. So before that, there was, at a certain point, a potential for communalities, But then trying to highlight the class difference, the middle class difference, because someone is coming from upper middle class, others are coming from medium or lower classes. To a certain extent, that potential of communality seems to me cancelled, at least starting from 2020.
Yeah.
I don't know what does it mean in terms of practice, but what it seems is that the city is trying to, many cities in Europe are trying to basically build a new fake kind of ideology of middle class, which doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you a lot for this.